Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event in the Living Heritage Sharing Series. I am Jérôme Melançon. I've been advising the Vice President Research at the U of R regarding the Living Heritage Research Cluster. Over the past year, a bit more than a year now, with the help of the Humanities Research Institute, we created this series to develop research and partnerships around living heritage. So with this series, we hoped to bring people together, offer a chance to researchers, those who run programs, those who are simply interested in living heritage across the province, to learn more about the work that's being done. So we've been more or less alternating lately between university and community presenters to offer a variety of perspectives and help each of us deepen our understanding of what living heritage and intangible cultural heritage are and can be. I do want to take a moment to thank everyone who has taken part, attended, and shared the information for these talks too. Specific thanks to the Living Heritage Steering Group, to Charity Marsh, and before her, Francesco Fertolini, for the great collaboration with the HRI, and Sarah Hogue for the support she's been bringing to the series. I'm looking forward to the next incarnation of this project to see how we can further work around living heritage in Saskatchewan. As you're guessing, this will be our last event, at least for this term, for the next little while in this series. I also want to acknowledge that I'm hosting this event on the traditional territory of the Nehiyawak, the Anishinaabeg, the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and on the traditional homeland of the Métis and Michif nations. The U of R also has a presence on Treaty 6, and many of you are located there as well. Although these acknowledgements are a good way to always remember that we are speaking about topics that may relate in ways that we don't always think of to colonialism, the experiences of Indigenous peoples, and maybe remind us of the privileges that allow us to talk about topics that don't deal directly with the realities of Indigenous peoples. Today we do have the chance to look at colonialism, to look at its contemporary significance and the forms that it takes. And so this connection to the territory will be very important today. I'm just going to note that this event is being recorded, at least the formal part of it. Will stop before the Q&A, and it'll be shared on the U of R's YouTube channel. Our presenter for the session today is Dr. Cindy Hansen. She is a full professor in sociology and social studies and the incoming president of the Canadian Association for the Study of Adult Education. Her research and teaching illustrates participatory and community-based approaches to themes related to gender, social justice issues, and Indigenous learning. She is the principal investigator on a SSHRC-funded study, reconciling perspectives and building public memory, learning from the independent assessment process related to the Indian Residential School Settlements Compensation for Abuse, or the IAP. Her talk today is titled A Duty to Remember, Survivor Testimony, and Indian Residential School Abuse. I'll be keeping your microphones off. Obviously, you can help me with that as well. Please, if you want to type your questions in the box, you're welcome to do that. We'll address them at the end. If you have any questions for the formal aspect of this, please don't hesitate to ask them in the chat as well. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Hansen now. Cindy?
Thanks, Jerome, and thanks for organizing this series. And I want to acknowledge that I'm up in Treaty 6 in Saskatoon, and welcome to other people who are in other locations, spaces, and reflecting and acknowledging on the place they are. I decided to do this talk today for several reasons, and one of them is that as I work on this SSHRC project, which is about reconciling memories and learning about perspectives that people have on the independent assessment process, especially some of the 38,000 survivors that were involved in it, what I want to look at is the TRC's recommendation that we have a duty to create a memory and to create a record. And so as you listen to that, I would like you also to think about how that record can be created given the circumstances, particularly around the IAP. So I'm going to present using a PowerPoint because there's quite a few little details in here that might be triggered in different ways if you can see them versus me just talking. And I'm really looking forward to more of an interactive discussion as we get going in the process. So let me just share my screen. Can you see it? Yes, okay. So the photo on here, by the way, is one of the, I think the only residential school left in Saskatchewan. So, and it's in southern Saskatchewan. And this is where, okay. So as I said before, both the Residential School Settlement Agreement and the TRC talk about a duty to remember. And that duty to remember is in relation to Canada's history of colonialism and the abuse of children that happened at Indian residential schools, which is the topic of my study, is not just an abuse to those children, but an abuse to the communities in which they lived. So in terms of situating the IAP, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement had 5 parts. So there was funding for supports through the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. There was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There were commemorative activities, you know, plaques, things like that. And there were 2 components that were based on compensation. The first one was the common experience payment, and that was for lack of culture and language that happened to people who attended residential schools in the 150 years in which they operated. And the other one was the independent assessment process. The independent assessment process is the topic of my study. So the independent assessment process, and just maybe let me say that the settlement agreement was agreed to by Indigenous organizations, churches, federal government, and all stakeholders were party to that when it was signed in 2006. So the independent assessment process is the mechanism by which former students of Indian residential schools were compensated for abuse they suffered at those schools. And it's serious physical and sexual abuse. The fact that 91% of survivors who went through the process were compensated speaks to high levels of abuse that took place in the schools. They went through, of the 38,000 that applied by the deadline of 2012, 27,000 went through hearings. At those hearings, they weren't, the language around them, they say they weren't called hearings, but if you read a lot of the literature on it, they're still called hearings. So they were called adjudications, and they were an out-of-court process that was supposed to be non-adversarial. And at that, that process would take place in a place chosen by the survivor, and they would be, the survivor would be there. They could have supports, health supports, usually a regional health support worker. Family could be there, whoever they chose to be there. And as the process was led by an adjudicator. And there were 100 adjudicators in Canada trained just to work with survivors in this process. So this process is different from any other process in settlement agreements, like if you look at the 60 Scoop or day schools now, in that there was an actual face-to-face testimonial telling process that was part of it. And that doesn't exist in the other settlement agreements that are happening now. So the IEP and the settlement agreements ended on March 31st, so about a month and a half ago. So you can see that the process for the IEP was much longer than it was, for example, for the TRC. And it involved many more people giving testimonies than the TRC. So some people ask, what's the difference? Another difference is that the TIC was considered public. So probably people on this Zoom call, some of you would have gone to the hearings, whereas the IEP hearings were private, and they were, a survivor telling their story of abuse to an adjudicator and other people who would be in the room. So there was a big court case in 2017 to decide what to do with the testimonies and records that came out of the IEP. And this was really significant because this is the largest collection of records of abuse of children probably in the world. And the Supreme Court ruled in 2017 that the records would be destroyed. So they established, it was appealed by the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and they lost. But what happened in the appeal is Judge Perel decided that if people wanted to keep their record, they could individually decide to do so. And the responsibility for that was given to the Indian Residential School Secretariat. The Secretariat was arm's length from the federal government. The federal government wanted the records destroyed. In all processes of the IEP, the federal government has wanted the records destroyed. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. So we've got an agreement and recommendations of the TRC that talk about the importance of memory and records. And we've got a federal government that's adamant about destruction of records. So we need to think about these things really critically in terms of how they're happening. The understanding of abuse in the IEP was complex. My first study on the IEP looked at how I did a gender analysis of how it was constructed and how levels of abuse and harms and compensations were realized in the process, and potentially, where there was gender bias. For example, if you were abused physically or sexually in the residential school, and as a result of that abuse, you couldn't hold a job, you were compensated, and so much for each abuse and harm and loss of opportunity. However, there's a formula you can actually look at. However, if you were a victim of physical or sexual abuse and you lost your children to the child welfare system, there's not levels of compensation for that. So you can see that things like unpaid work remain unvalued in this system. And of course, those have gendered impacts. So that's what I looked at in my first study. The second study I looked at was the second study that I have is called, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to be looking at my records or at my notes, and I forget to completely. So the second study is Reconciling Perspectives and Building Public Memory, Learning from the Independent Assessment Process. And what we really want to do in this study, and this is a SSHRC Insight grant, so it's a lot more money than the first study. It's a national study, and there's scholars involved from across Canada, as well as grad students who are doing an amazing job. So the purpose of the study is to look at different perspectives or experiences of how people understood the IEP, and then to understand and analyze these experiences, looking at settler colonial relationships, looking at hierarchies of knowledge and power, and politics of reconciliation. Because when this process was put in place, the then Minister of Indian Affairs called it a process of healing and reconciliation. So it's very interesting how those words disappear later on. But anyway, and the other purpose was to determine, develop, and implement effective strategies for transferring knowledge about the IAP into the general public through processes like public pedagogies, using theater. One of the ideas is to use a graphic novel, etc. Because knowing that the testimonies are going to be destroyed, what does that mean in terms of what's remembered about the largest class action in Canadian history, the largest incidents of abuse of children in the world, and what kind of records remain, right? So, just think about that. So again, there's no public testimony that's left of the IAP, except most recently, and the IAP has been full of court cases. It's become a very litigious sort of issue when it shouldn't have been that, but in part it was a class action, and class actions don't tend to resolve things in a way that would be more about mediation, etc. So this is the only study about the IAP that's looking at the full gamut of it and how different perspectives around it were created and lived. About 2 years ago, we held a national conference called Whose Settlement, looking at settlement agreements, the 60 Scoop, and the IAP. So the way we're doing this study is through critical discourse analysis, primarily using in vivo, and we're very interested in looking at public records. So the two ways we're doing this are through a Hansard study that part of it is done. Actually, we went from 2006 to 2018, looking at Hansard and how elected officials talked about the IAP. Then we're involved now in doing a content analysis of media from 2006 to 2021. And the third part of this is interviews and focus groups with survivors, regional health support workers, lawyers, adjudicators, judges, deputy chief adjudicators, and I hope I didn't miss anyone. Oh, and psychologists that were involved in the process. So in the discourse analysis, we're looking specifically at discourse as socially constructed, and discourse as the way in which we make sense of the world around us. And we think about, how is it framed? How is this discourse framed, and why does that matter? So if we observe particular events and what they mean, we come to a certain understanding of them from the words that are used. So for example, if we listen to Scott Moe talk about the pandemic, and then we listen to the words of Dr. Tam talking about the pandemic, we might hear a very different discourse. And that discourse, we might have our own ideas about the pandemic, but that discourse in some way influences how we start to think about the reality we're living. So that's what discourse is about. So we're analyzing that. So we're analyzing, how our ways of speaking about the world create an understanding of the world. When elected officials talk about the IAP, how do we come to understand the world? When we read certain things or certain ways of talking about it in the media, how do we come to construct that? And how does that construction relate to things like hierarchies and power relationships? How does it relate to a settler colonial construct? Does it help to dismantle that, or does it reinforce it, or something else? So when we finish the media analysis, which we're doing right now, we will be using a Foucault analysis to do that one. So what we're looking at is how we construct meaning around those stories. So you know, what is the IAP? What does it mean? Who are the primary actors? What are their roles? How does that get reported on, et cetera, et cetera. So the words we choose, or the words that are used by these particular players in public spaces, become the framework through which we understand an experience. And if those are the only records that remain, if the testimonies are destroyed, how do we come to understand the IAP? How do we come to understand abuse that took place in Indian residential schools? So the study seeks to explore how that reality is constructed in public forums, and who are the primary actors, what are their roles in framing that discourse. So when we looked at the House of Commons, we looked at the debates from 2004 to the present. And what we found is, for the largest class action in Canadian history, and I keep repeating this because this is what's amazing, there were only 28 references to the IAP in the House of Commons debates from 2004 to 2000, it should say 2019. It's alarming. So what you have here is the IAP is the blue line below here, and the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement is the green. So this talks about, you know, how many times was it talked about? 36 times in 2007. It's not very much. We're talking about the IAP itself was an agreement that ended up costing $3.33 billion. Billion. Okay, so what we see is there's very little information here coming out of elected officials. And what we found is, when they do talk, it's mainly related to political partisan positioning. So what we found is, you know, what we asked is, what do elected officials discuss about the IAP, reveal about the implementation of transitional justice mechanisms, which are transitional justice mechanisms are mechanisms where reconciliation is possible, and in settler colonial states, and about colonial relations. And what we found is that our findings suggest that elected officials have created discourses about survivors and the Canadian state that affirm serious concerns with the application of transitional justice. So serious concerns with reconciliation. Also serious concerns in how we come to think about elected officials talking about reconciliation, when in fact their discussions were more often around politically partisan, like, oh, when your party was in power, you did this, you know, not about deep structural issues that presented themselves in the IAP, for example. So what we found here is, in terms of key takeaways, the red is liberals, the blue is conservatives, and the orange is NDP. So this is, it was basically politically partisan discussion. And this is how many times it was talked about by the different parties. So you see, when the Harper's government was in power is when the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement came in, and when the IAP and its predecessor, the ADR, were there, and it was talked about a lot more. But by the time 2016, 2017, you've got zero. And when they're talking about it, for example, when they're talking about it, they're talking about as their commitment to Indigenous people, bringing closure to the IAP, bringing closure to the to residential school abuses. To some degree, there was a contrast, particularly around two NDP members, Romeo Saganish, I think is his name, and Charlie Angus. And Charlie Angus spoke more about the IAP than any other elected party official, although primarily around St. Anne's. And the framing in the Hansard is that mainly around St. Anne's Residential School. Although from informal discussions, etc., with or interviews with regional health support workers and survivors, we know that St. Anne's Residential School isn't necessarily the worst, but if you look at media and the Hansard, that's what gets repeated. So the media created is essentially a common sense around, so this is now we're moving into the media analysis piece. So we looked at media reports from 2006 to 2021 using keywords, ran searches on Canadian major dailies, and came up with a database of articles that we've been going through and coding. We found 246 articles on Indian Residential School and the IAP. So what a lot of people who are writing about this talk about, though, is that the way the IAP is framed in the media, it's very much about an Indigenous settler relationship where you have a taxpayer's burden, where you have compensation that creates some form of resolution. And settlers as taxpayers is a common rhetoric that gets exposed. So the IAP was presented as reconciliation, but it's really not clear from outcomes that we have so far whether or not that was operationalized or understood. The Secretariat, Indian Residential School Secretariat, called it a success because 90% of claimants were compensated. So when in our analysis, we decided not only to look at some of the national daily newspapers, but or media sources, but also to look at APTN and Eagle Feather News, which are more Indigenous media, because we wanted to see if there was a difference in reporting. The total articles by news sources showed that APTN had more than double the articles on the IAP compared to other sources. Globe and Mail was second, CBC was third. However, we can't abstract that saying that Indigenous media necessarily had more, because Eagle Feather News actually had very little. What we do find, though, is that there's a specific reporter by the name of Jorge Barrera who worked for APTN and then worked for CBC, and he did a lot of reporting on the IAP. And the IAP is very complex to understand, and I think that's part of the story there. So the coverage over time shows that, and this is fairly common with particular issues when they're in the heat of the day, 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, you've got a lot more articles appearing in those newspapers in that time. What were they reporting on? What were how was it being framed? There was some reporting on healing and reconciliation. Most of the time, the media spent their time talking about the different actors involved in the process. Historical records and testimonies was a small part of that, but these are the main topics that were discussed, and intergenerational impacts also took up some space. Framing the actors. So there are quite a few actors involved in the data. These are not necessarily the people speaking, but the people that were spoke about. And in fact, what we find, a lot of the speaking was about Indigenous peoples, but in fact, very little of the media was through the voices of survivors. So, And finally, still in the works, we've now done about 50 interviews, and we have a few more left. We had a session set up with survivors through the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation as a collaborator on this project. And we had a session set up at the center that was supposed to take place in February of last year, and you know what happened. So unfortunately, COVID has created a barrier for us. So, but we're looking at one of the key things about this is to try and create public records. So we've been trying to do talks, conferences, papers, articles, and now are looking at the idea of a graphic novel, comic, a book, and a play, and one play has already come out from a couple collaborators. So there's still lots of gaps here. There's still things that need further research, and one of the things is looking at class actions to resolve deep-seated settler colonial historical issues, the 60-day schools, etc. Canada seems to be the only place in the world that's resolving all of its colonial history through class action lawsuits. And I think people need to say, you know, why are we doing this? How are we doing this? And maybe who's benefiting from this? So finally, I want to end with WordFind. These are actually, we've taken the data from the media, the 200 and some media articles, put them together, and the largest words in here are the words that are most frequently reproduced in the media, and then the other ones are also important or are reproduced, but lesser so given the size. So you can see that as something that involved reconciliation becomes quite small. And I think there's healing somewhere in here, but maybe it didn't even make the cut. Okay, so that's where I'm going to leave off. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen if I can, so that we can talk.
Well, thank you so much, Cindy, for this great talk that helps us think about what do we do with the heritage that many don't want to keep. They don't want to keep living, and these memories, these events, and both the ways that people have developed to cope with these difficult situations, with this violence. That is the heritage that's been passed on, and these events that were for a long time not spoken about. And I thought in terms of living heritage, it's really important to think about what is not kept, either because we want to destroy it or because we don't know how to keep it, we don't know how to pass it down in healthy ways. And I think your research goes a long way to help us understand that.
Could I just add a little bit more to that? Because this was done through a class action suit where it was based on individual law, the students, the survivors, well, they were students at the time, but the survivors' testimony became private. And this is complex because this, first of all, the people developing the agreement hadn't thought about this from the onset, and it could have been done a lot differently. And people could have understood that more so that you could redact identifying material. You don't have to include names, places, etc. You can put in Spain, for example, when they had the records from abuse from Franco being in power, put those records away for 50 years and took them out redacted 50 years later, so that that history would still be understood by people 50 or 100 years from now. What Canada's doing, in the destruction of these testimonies, is that history disappears. There's no record. So so it's complex because it puts the onus now on survivors to decide whether or not they want to share that knowledge. And yet they were taught, or they were told in the hearings, that it was private, that it was personal. And lots of people, as adjudicators told us, lots of people never would have shared that information if it hadn't been secret. So it's complex. It's not a, it's not a, but we do know that the telling of that testimony, there's lots of empirical evidence to say how important it is as a healing process.
Thank you so much for this, Cindy.